So, Halo Combat Evolved, a game so unique and standout, it single-handedly kickstarted first-person shooters as we know them today. So what does it mean for a hallmark of a game to receive a remake 2 decades later? Let's talk about it. Halo is one of those games that were and still are considered one of the greatest video games ever made. Now, while much of that sentiment comes from the influence that Halo has had over gaming that shaped shooters for console into what they are today, like multiplayer for example, another reason why is that there's simply nothing else like Halo. The design is distinctly Halo's own. The campaign narrative, the combat loop with the sandbox and the enemies, an absolute banger of a soundtrack, among other things, earned itself a place to be called one of the greats. Anyway, enough glazing. Let's get to the point. Starting with, what does it even mean to remake a game? Well, considering the kind of trends we have seen with recent remakes of games, to remake a game means to elevate the experience the original game offered. Now I say elevate, not replace, because the remake of a game allows reinterpretation of the original design, without which the remake isn't possible. Simply put, the original always comes first, and the remake is value addition to what the original was already providing. On top of that, you could say a remake is a faithful remix of old and new, because what being authentic falls short, the next best thing to do is to be faithful. With that out of the way, we're going to cover in a different aspect of this subject. First, covering what this remake means for the game itself, going over what kind of changes it can implement, then what it means for the developers behind the game, because a lot has happened recently, and the potential problems the remake can face. Before we go ahead, I'd like to give a short PSA that anything being discussed here is purely based off of speculation and rumors. Apparently, this remake, which surfaced sometime during 2024, is going to be revealed at the upcoming Halo World Championship, which is, again, a rumor. While it's one thing to keep expectations, it's not the same as believing in rumors. None of what we have heard so far has been confirmed by the developers themselves. So, all I want to say is, don't take everything you hear about this topic as face value. That includes what I have to say about it because, like I said, it's all speculation and rumors, and I don't want people to have false expectations set because they heard someone say certain things and then go yell that Halo is dead because it didn't happen that exact same way. Alright, PSA is over. To understand what changes could be made to this masterpiece of a formula, we have to learn the formula first. The formula that is Halo's design philosophy, courtesy of Ruby of Blue, who some of you might recognize as the author of the incredible Halo Rebalanced mods, to whom I owe much of my design knowledge. Go check him out, he's got amazing content, comes down to 3 different parts. First being the 30 seconds of fun, referring to the immediate interactions between the sandbox elements. Then 3 minutes of fun, that refers to the average length of an enemy encounter, which is concerned with the people using those sandbox elements. And finally 30 minutes of fun, that refers to the runtime of one level of mission, depicting the overall level design and narrative. It's simple yet complex because one change to any element here has a snowball effect on everything else. If you tweak a gun or vehicle or piece of equipment, you tweak the allies or enemies using it, then you tweak the level featuring said allies and enemies. It's all connected together. Coming to Combat Evolved in 2001, while the core philosophy of Halo has remained relevant to this day, it goes without saying that the other parts of the design in this particular game have, for the lack of a better term, aged. Like we all did playing these games. Please remind me to never crack this joke again. Now, of course, it's not a binary situation here. There's a lot of obvious and not so obvious things that need to be touched up. So let's crack on with it. First up, we have 30 seconds of fun. Like I said earlier, the sandbox of weapons and enemy interactions is what made Halo, well, Halo. And for a game like Combat Evolved, which already has such a concise, tightened roster of weapons, makes it rather tricky to make changes that add new layers to it, all the while keeping the set changes meaningful to the overall philosophy that makes CE such a standout compared to other games, even in its own franchise. One place we can start would be the cut content for the game, content that didn't happen to get the polish it deserved. First up, the flamethrower, a close range area denial weapon, and we all know just the one enemy who loves to get up close and personal with us. Jokes aside, it would make for a rather cool addition for close range combat against lower ranks of enemies against alongside the needler and shotgun. Secondly, the fuel rod gun, a weapon carried by grunts during the second half of the game, and adjacent to the rocket launcher that trades high damage for high rate of fire, meaning you get to annoy the ever-loving shit out of your enemies by summoning a volley of fuel rods over their heads, providing you can temper a trigger finger to maintain heat output. Third, the energy sword, the weapon carried by highest ranking elites in the game. I'm not sure how this could fit within the sandbox of combat evolved. It's a close range weapon, sure, except it's a melee weapon. It's the one hit slice and dice weapon, which is already making it a viable option against a particular enemy. But aside from that, it's essentially a power weapon. Though it would be interesting to see it function within the CE environment where lunging isn't a thing yet. And I also have a rather tasty idea for how it can work, which I'll talk about later. Fourth, the Sentinel Beam, a weapon carried by, well, sentinels who appear in the second half of the game. It's a cool idea for a weapon that is all about damage regardless of what you throw at it at the cost of rapidly burning through the battery and a decent range. Though I'm not entirely sure how to balance it against the flamethrower as the two have somewhat a similar niche of close range suppression. But I suppose it's still different enough because unlike the flamethrower, which is an AoE based weapon, the Sentinel Beam is not. And battery management is a thing compared to the flamethrower, which has to be reloaded. And of course, the existing weapons roster can also use a slight touch up. Say the Needler actually doing something for once as a Covenant automatic weapon. Rest of the sandbox, I think it's decently balanced, though that isn't to say it couldn't hurt some more tweaking to make it perfect. Speaking of which, one gripe I've had playing Halo, a little thing known as the precision weapon meta, meaning players would ultimately have to use a headshot weapon to get the best damage output against enemies, depending upon difficulty. Now it hasn't really been an issue with Combat Evolved, but would become one in future titles where a precision weapon almost always holds one out of two weapon slots in the player arsenal, which kind of defeats the point of mastering the sandbox, don't you think? Don't get me wrong, it's far from easy to get headshots, especially with the pistol in CE, with the low bullet magnetism and shot leading, but with how later games treat the precision weapon, with the addition of battle rifle into the sandbox, automatic weapons and other niche of weapons suffer because of the amount of versatility and convenience provided to the player. Bottom line is, let the precision weapons reward precision from players. If they want to go spray and slay with weapons like the AR and plasma rifle and needler, let them do that. If they want to be the gremlin that gets out close and personal, or play psychological warfare with cloud control or area denial, let them do that. Allow the players to express their skill with their understanding of how sandbox elements work and mesh with each other to create different synergies, though they don't have to rely on a specific set of weapons for every single scenario. That said, if I were to add a couple new weapons, I'd like to see something like the support class weapon, like the cut M73 LMG and plasma repeater from Reach, tuned to have high damage output being tempered by trigger control or heat output in case of the plasma repeater, which itself can have its own quirks. Aside from that, I don't think a grenade launcher would be a half bad of an addition to the sandbox, though it'll be hard to find a place in one where grenades on their own are as great as they come. That reminds me, I'd be doing a disservice if I didn't talk about vehicles in this game. Aside from being an avenue for large-scale combat, they're essentially an extension of Halo's combat philosophy known as the dance. An intricate balance between offense, that being guns, grenades and melee, defense, that is health, and movement. Taking a look at Concordant here, the Covenant Wraith is an instant and obvious yes to the addition. While it is surely cool, its niche is far different than that of the UNSC Scorpion because unlike the Scorpion being a more defensive unit, the Wraith is more defensive since its mortars function similar to how the fuel rod gun does, making it a tool for crowd control. There's also the Rocket Hog, which isn't in the original Xbox version but was added to the Gearbox PC port and the MCC version, trading infantry support of the chain gun for anti-vehicle capabilities of the rockets, which only kind of makes sense because vehicles weren't universally destructible until Halo 2. Another addition would be the Spectre from the Halo 2, which is basically the Covenant's Warthog, This was also supposed to be in Combat Evolved under the name of Shadow, but didn't make it in the final version, so there's that. Not sure how it can be implemented without disturbing everything else, so let me know what you think. Another topic, and a highly contested one at that, would be the inclusion of sprint in this game. I know it's a touchy subject considering how long it's been, but I'll try to be nuanced about it. As of now, sprint in Halo has kind of reached a point where it boils down to preference. It doesn't really matter if you use it, though that isn't to say it doesn't impact gameplay when it used. I've heard people to say it's to speed up gameplay, but I'd argue it's not so much about speed as it is about positioning. Even for the quote-unquote slow original games, you can still play it pretty smooth if you know how to need to position yourself and your way around the sandbox. Slow can be smooth and smooth can be fast. Sprint, slide and clamber, at least in Infinite's philosophy, are essentially a layer over that positioning. It may be marginally fast, but still fast enough to make a difference in their positioning. Similarly, sliding makes a player a harder target to hit due to the character tucking in and generally staying on the bottom half of the screen, meaning they can throw other senses off. Clamber as well, it's a subtle hint for the player about the verticality within a space. It doesn't necessarily invalidate crouch jumping from the originals because it's not about whether or not you can hit a jump, it's about how. Classic Halo and parts of modern Halo interpret stuff like this not as a part of a movement shooter, but a platformer, if that makes sense. While it may not be entirely problematic, its addition in a case in like Combat Evolved does put to question where it wants to go for modern or classic. As far as the feel of the remake and the trend of innovation is concerned, personally I'm staying neutral to this. I'd like to know what you guys think. So that's the sandbox covered. Let's talk people using them that aren't the player, aka the Marines, Covenant and the Flood, making our way into 3 minutes of fun. Honestly, there isn't much for me to comment on here, but I think there is a couple of quality of life changes that can be implemented to the AI now that we are no longer limited by hardware, meaning more big battles. That being said, let's start with the Marines. For an ally, they should feel like something the player can take advantage of. They may be lower ranked compared to the Spartan that is the player, but that does not mean they can't be useful beyond being cannon fodder for the enemies. They should be competent enough to make a real change within the encounter without having to babysit them too much. Say, varied ranges for firing different weapons, like a Marine holding a sniper rifle would hang back as Overwatch, or holding something like the shotgun would have them being more up close, and holding something like the AR or plasma rifle would have them being more on par with your steps. Then also more concentrated and consistent firing patterns and the like, so any sort of attack on an enemy feels like a coordinated one. When one wins, everyone wins. That is such an Xbox thing to say, though not after the atrocity that was the change of price of Game Pass to $30. Other than that, backporting features like Marines being able to drive vehicles and switching weapons with them would also go a long way to add value to such encounters. Another thing that I think would keep the encounters fresh are boss fights. Now, I know that classic Halo has never really been one for boss fights because it feels kind of counterproductive for its design, but think about it this way. A boss fight by definition is basically any character that tests the player's understanding of the game's mechanics in ways other characters won't. It's not just a bigger health bar we're concerned with here. We're talking different sorts of behavior, constructed spectacle, and narrative weight. Halo can easily accomplish that with the higher ranking enemies it throws at you, and in turn, dealing with them generates spectacle narratively, because almost no fight is ever a 1v1 in a game like Halo, and boss fights aren't an exception here. Case in point, Halo 3 Scarab battles. And the weight it puts down is from rewarding the player with the power weapon the boss used. Remember the tasty idea I mentioned earlier? This is how you do it right. So, elites, right? The Spartans equals. We already know there's higher ranking elites like the Ultra who sport white armor, boast a large amount of health, larger than the usual ranks anyway, and also draw the energy sword upon aggravation. There's also the Zealot whose entire philosophy is based on close range combat because of the energy sword, meaning you'll have to keep a minimum set distance to not get killed in one hit, but you're also pressing down on the Zealot by either your own weapons or your allies or both. preferably both because of the spectacle. There's also the elite general from Reach, who usually carries a heavy weapon with himself that could also fit into this philosophy. But to add that in would mean it will probably require more powerful Covenant weapons in the sandbox, which there aren't many in case of Combat Evolved. So that's something to consider. Regardless, I hope I got the idea across that when you face this significantly powerful enemy, you'll use the sandbox and the other players around you to withstand the terror of said significantly powerful enemy, and then get the satisfaction of making the enemy feel that same terror with the power weapon previously used by now deceased powerful enemy. Speaking of which, this is already being applied to an extent with how hunters work in the game, or should have worked in Combat Evolved at least. Big tanky enemies whose sole purpose is to introduce power weapons into the combat loop, who the player dances around while their allies help them out. Vehicles also do this as well, so layers are being added to the philosophy of the boss fight in Halo. Taking a page out of what its sequel can offer, Halo 2 stands as an amazing example of how boss fights are essentially a giant set piece in motion. Say the Regret boss fight. I know it's not exactly well put together, but the idea is there, fighting high-ranking squads while an old alien occasionally harasses you with his floating chair beam. There's, of course, Halo 3 with the Scarab being a two-phase fight, having to fight it with vehicles first, then moving into destroy its core, or just board the Scarab however you want. Combat Evolved may not be as sophisticated, and truthfully it doesn't need to be, but it can still emulate that on a micro level instead of what it's equal to on a macro level. The closest example I could possibly imagine would be the optional boss fights in Halo Infinite, aka HVDs, where it's you, your squad of marines, and the banished that's out with each other, except it's isolated. Other than that, the idea is basically the same. You're fighting a high ranking soldier and getting their weapon as a reward for taking them down. So checking a couple of those every so often helps keep with the content of the level remain fresh, as well as having players reevaluating their strategies on the go to fully master the sandbox as it comes, aside from being obvious to the narrative itself. You guys let me know what you think. Then finally comes along 30 minutes of fun, possibly the most obvious part that requires an overhaul, as well as the most fascinating one considering the narrative influencing level design. The story itself, as we all know, is the hallmark for Halo. Combat Evolved is no exception, though that isn't to say it cannot be better. And since Halo Studios has this obsession with connecting the games to the extended media covering Halo, which isn't a bad idea, but the cohesion has been anything but the best. Lucky for them, they now have the perfect opportunity to write a story that remains faithful to the original while also deepening the lore surrounding the events covered by it. Now that I've brought up external media, Combat Evolved has a novel adaptation by William C. Dietz, sorry if I mispronounced the name, covering this story in details the game never goes into, called Halo the Flood. Diving into the book, there's already quite a bit more to UNSC's story about the fight on the ring itself, such as their holdout that is Alpha Base, which we find out after rescuing Captain Jacob Keyes. This phase also introduces ODSTs, who we wouldn't see officially getting a limelight until years later into the franchise, which sets a precedent for the kind of people who are fighting this war. Since this game has a heavy emphasis on Marines, maybe more so than others, it wouldn't hurt to see characters like Marcus Stacker, who, fun fact, is based on two people who worked on the original game, and Chip Stubbo get some explicit focus as well, alongside the beloved Avery Johnson. Another thing the book does, which isn't explicitly acknowledged in the game, until the very end I guess, is the cat and mouse chase happening throughout the story. A Spec Ops elite by the name of Zuka Zamami being tasked with the elimination of the Master Chief, who we supposedly kill in the final mission. Considering that, I guess this could be one way to introduce playable elites back into Halo. Might be wishful thinking for all I know, but the idea is not too far-fetched if you ask me. Anyway, that's all I could think of that could be adapted from the Flood. If you guys have any suggestions on this, do let me know in the comments. The beauty of Bungie Halo stories are they're pretty minimal in their presentation, almost like a poem in a way, being very efficient and impactful even in all its implicit nature, telling you just enough to make a complete story, but still leave enough gaps to wonder what else is out there in the universe. A YouTuber called Lando made an incredible video about this topic, and I highly recommend to check it out if you want to learn more. Its focus lies on the world it inhabits, compared to the later titles which are more character driven. What would be amazing for this game's remake is finding that slightly blurred line between storytelling about these two different aspects. Its nuance meeting layers. Now, let's talk mission design. While it was rather spectacular for what it pulled off with the original Xbox console, that spectacle kind of starts to fade when you remember that the interior level design is kind of the same corridors, just copied and pasted over one another. I don't think I need you to remind you of the atrocity that is the library, which is just 30 minutes of fun that slowly turns into 30 minutes of agony the further you go into the level. The problem with the library isn't just that it's repetitive. The story essentially stops progressing altogether thanks to the rather straightforward objective of the level. That isn't to say other levels don't have straightforward objectives, but the library is an outlier where the development of the narrative is almost non existent. You're told that there's a problem occurring somewhere in the facility, but the effect on the ongoing narrative is just fighting more flood. It's structurally bland compared to even the simplest of levels like the Pillar of Autumn, where the environment actually reflects upon the gravity, or the lack thereof because it's space, of the situation. Moreover, it certainly doesn't help that following 343 Guilty Spark, the level, not the character, which had such good minimalist storytelling, the library has none of that either. For a level that was originally going to be the proper introduction to the Flood as a faction, its biggest strength of being an overwhelming force would have become its biggest weakness because there is nothing else to support it. But hey, at least that did lead to a plot twist that still holds up to this day. Since we have much more control over the levels now, I say that this level should turn into something that takes time to explore the flood, exploring the who, because the what is already being taken care of by gameplay, psychological horror with the whole Shakespearean fatalist evil vibe that the faction would take on in later games, because in context of Combat Evolved, they're just space zombies, as well as an extended lore paired with the rather disturbingly calm commentary from 343 Guilty Spark himself as he plays tour guide throughout the level as presented in his dialogue. If the flood was studied and researched here, there should be signs everywhere of the chilling fall from grace the Forerunners faced, trying to contain the wrath of an undead god which led to the ring being made in the first place. As we make our way to the activation index, the overwhelming force of the flood should be tearing the library itself apart. The first sign of just how powerful this new faction is, selling the urgency of the dire situation. Until we get hit by another plot twist in the very next level, anyway. Speaking of which, there's this argument that the third act of the game is just the first act, played backwards. And while I do agree with that statement, I think there's more to it than meets the eye. The problem comes from the fact that afterwards of the library, the game is essentially a three-way fight with the constant switch from tactically fighting the Covenant to then surviving the Flood onslaught, which I don't think is realized to the full potential. Not to mention, it utilizes the layout of two of the longest levels in the game as well, so it's understandable why people think it's that way. I'm not entirely sure if there's a fix to this, so let me know what you think. Also, just a bonus idea, the CE remake should definitely do a campaign DLC based on the novel Halo First Strike. It makes so much sense. It's essentially Halo 1.5 in a way, and it's just more PvE content. Hopefully, in a way that it feels like a self contained story but still adds to the overall story so far. There's a few other stuff that I want to go over quickly. First, the art style. I know modern Halo has been pretty notorious for not really feeling like Halo, which has been mostly solved. I say there's just one thing that needs to be nailed, which is the mood of whatever area we're in. Say the Forerunners being all brutalist, not so shiny metal, or the somewhat curvy purplish pink Covenant, or the blocky angular UNSC design. That includes the lighting being managed as well. Next, the music. You can't just say Halo and not expect someone to immediately start singing the choir. Now, that can be kind of tricky because of the sound design going into it, so that's something to keep in mind. Emulation is key here. Stuff like this, the Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary wanted to put its own spin on, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but the vision got lost somewhere. The Vengeful Vidam made a great video on the different stages Combat Evolved Anniversary went through in those areas, so if you're interested in that, definitely check this out. So bottom line is, pretty graphics are cool and all, but mood matters too. Well, that was all the rage about the campaign side of things. Now let's talk multiplayer. I saved this towards the end of the discussion because I think it's a much different topic to go over design wise, and also because I wanted to address another rumor going around multiplayer, specifically the one saying that the remake is seemingly not getting a multiplayer component to it. And while there is much to be concerned about, I believe there's a couple of reasons why this is a good or bad idea. I'm not admittedly the most educated in this, I'm more of a campaign guy than a multiplayer guy, so I did some digging and here's what I found. Exploring the design choices made for the multiplayer of Combat Evolved gives a couple of hints as to why this might be the case. Because compared to its sequels, CE has far different ideologies in terms of map design and sandbox balance. Plasma weapons in the game, specifically the plasma rifle and the cannons on the Ghost, can stun players within the game, a feature that got removed in later iterations. Another feature tied to the active camouflage called Quick Camo, which refers to how fast the camo regrows after a weapon is fired, is also integral to playstyle certain weapons allow in the game, with the assault rifle and plasma rifle having the best timings, meaning the shotgun won't be the only option for CQC or stealth. This, to my knowledge, was also removed in later games. Another feature would be grenades doubling as ways to manipulate physics, which leads to really cool plays with how equipment or power weapons were launched off their spawn positions. While this hasn't been removed per se, it sure has been watered down over time. It's these features that which may as well have been passed off as gimmick for standards set by later Halo games that made the multiplayer of Combat Evolved such a cult classic amongst the community. When Halo 2 comes around with a much bigger focus on multiplayer, it makes sense why these features got removed in the first place. It not only had to be fun, but now it had to be fairly balanced as well. And considering there was no formal way to know about these features in the sandbox, and also the internet was nowhere near big as it is today, it meant that anyone who did know about it could instantly tilt the match to their advantage, potentially ruining other people's experiences. Then there's the map design. I'm not an expert on it, but it does raise the question of how the original maps will work in a modern Halo game. I mean, you're not going to have maps like Death Island or Boarding Action or fucking Chiron TL34 of all things in a Halo game of today. Another thing to keep in mind about, since we're talking Halo as a hallmark here, is the impact that it had on multiplayer beyond the game design. It's the reason why couch co-op was a thing, why LAN parties were a thing. Halo was a party game at its core, and the game you played with your friends and laughed at each other's misery while in game. You found new people online and made friends with them. I would remember watching a video by the Act Man about how Halo lost its identity as a party game, which talked about stuff like pre-game and post-game multiplayer lobbies and the ranks and service records being accessible through a player's tag, a map feeder systems, all of which would be slowly phased out of the games over time. While I don't blame the people who have been saying that Halo hasn't been the same after Bungie for being mad, if anything, I feel sorry that they had to go through this. It also sucks to see that as the scope for the multiplayer grew to reach more people, as did the online space in general. It ended up inviting toxicity into it, with people bullying or griefing others, among other things, being done in bad faith. The moderation for that was so harsh to the point that the original intent to connect with people got diminished. And I believe this might be the biggest reason why the multiplayer is not being considered for the remake. Not because it could potentially alienate its core audience by switching up the gameplay and the changes I mentioned, but because they don't want a game that is as communal as Combat Evolved to suffer from the woes of modern multiplayer games. I know MCC is still a thing, which is more so about preservation above all else, so that's a different story. Though if you ask me, I'd say that's exactly the reason why there should be a multiplayer, because it reinforces the original idea Bungie had with their vision of Halo, a place for people to come together and have fun in, something that has been missing in their own games. Doesn't matter if the game doesn't top the charts of popularity on streaming platforms or bring in the revenue from it being a competitive sport, but that isn't to say that it can't do both of those still, because if it wants to succeed, it has to be honest with itself and be unapologetically Halo. Labor Laden must be the biggest fist in this air right now. Okay, we've discussed the game, we've discussed how it could be remade. Now we discuss the developer side of things, the why it would be remade in light of certain events. For a long time coming, we have had rumors about Halo possibly making the switch to a different engine for its games, that being Unreal Engine 5, which we now know is a reality following the announcement in 2024 during a Halo World Championships event that 343 Industries, now Halo Studios, would be making the switch to UE5 for the future Halo games, thus bringing back the rumor of a Combat Evolved remake back to light. Well, I'm a bit lukewarm about this change because I happen to be a believer of bespoke proprietary engines specifically built with certain games in mind, like how Blam and Slipspace were designed alongside Halo. and Unreal happens to be a general purpose engine, I'm trying to look on the bright side by putting that bias away first. So, obviously, there's going to be a ton of questions that come to mind with this. First, is Halo on Unreal Engine, specifically Unreal Engine 5, even a good idea? Well, that's a difficult question. On one hand, I've already said that the engine is general purpose, so that does give me pause. But on the other hand, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad platform to make games out of. There have been quite a number of Unreal based games like the Batman Arkham series, the Mass Effect series, Mirror's Edge, the original one, the Ghost Runner series, Trepang 2, PUBG, Valorant, Marvel Rivals, Stalker 2, The Finals, Black Myth Wukong, Robocop Rogue City, and even Gears of War, which is an Xbox One franchise, that have been critically acclaimed across the board. And of course, there's also Silent Hill 2, the Elder Scrolls 4 Oblivion remaster, and the Metal Gear Solid Delta Snake Eater, which is the remake of MGS3. Have to mention remakes in a video about one, you know. But to say that the story ends there would mean to ignore the elephant in the room, that being UE5 itself. It's no secret that UE5 is a flawed engine. Every time a new game comes out and complains about poor hardware performance pops up online, it's more often than not a UE5 game, which is part of what's called the Unreal Effect, a bloated and unoptimized package that straight up hinders people's ability to actually play the game. The other part of the Unreal Effect happens to be a long-standing issue within the design of the games based on UE5, that they are visually the same games, which mostly comes from the engine's absurd push for photorealism in games, sacrificing artistic direction in the process, which is an even bigger problem when the game in question is Halo, and that is why I brought up art style earlier in the discussion of the game. So, to answer my question, while it isn't a resounding yes, there is definitely promise in this prospect. Speaking of promise, there is one thing in that announcement that they made that might just be the key to it all: Project Foundry. As Chris Matthews, the art director, would point out the significance of the name like a lore nerd, that is, Foundry being the place where the Halo era was built. Project Foundry is a research project to prepare people for the next steps of making Halo games, going as far to say that this project touches upon every part of the creative process, from the concept art to the VFX to the characters, vehicles, and weapons to make the future games of Halo. I assume this is happening mostly because they identified the long-time complaints people have had with UE5 that I mentioned earlier, and Project Foundry aims to alleviate those issues. This is Halo we are talking about after all, and the switch has to be done right. That said, as cynical as I'm about to sound, I'd say they should have done the same thing with Slipspace instead. Because why go through this when you already have a bespoke engine to do exactly what you want it to? Why spend time learning new code to work with when you could just, make the old code easier to read and iterate on? I know they admitted that managing an engine and making games at the same time is a difficult job, and it shows with the troubled development Halo Infinite went through and the post-launch support that followed. So in that case, the switch does make sense, but part of me still wonders why they couldn't afford to refine further the engine that is literally built to make Halo for future releases, instead choosing to make do with a general purpose engine with all the infamy in the world. Regardless, I remain hopeful that they will make good on their intent with this project they've embarked on. Continuing on to our next question, why bother with a remake of a 2.5-decade-old game now? Given the context I just put out, a remake of a game makes perfect sense because with a remake, the rules are more or less set in place to follow and it becomes easier to build the platform from the game being developed. This is the real-world consequence of changing the recipe in action, as Pierre Heinze would say in the announcement. Plus, I guess this is also kind of an apology for the mediocre remaster from 2011. Pretty poetic now that I think about it, since they're coming back to the game once more to figure out what made Halo great and hopefully showing us that they could do better, despite all odds. So, as of making this video, I just got wind of some news from Reps Gaming, who some of you might recognize as a famous reporter for Halo, as far as insider info is concerned. He came out saying that the engine powering the game might be, emphasis on might be, a hybrid between Unreal Engine 5 and the Blam engine used in Halo Reach, with Unreal doing the heavy lifting for the visuals while the Blam engine handles gameplay logic. This isn't entirely new because the Oblivion remaster I mentioned also does this as well, with the creation engine handling gameplay and Unreal being layered to handle visuals. If I'm allowed to speculate, what I think Halo Studios is doing here is that with this hybrid system, they're trying to cut down on the time for iteration because the game logic is already written for them, thanks to the BLAM engine. But the toolset surrounding it that developers used to make the actual game, which was the problem with Slipspace, is being mitigated using Unreal. It makes sense too when you remember Chris Matthews' same project found it touches upon every part of the creative process to prepare people for making the next Halo games. Among other things having come up in recent times that Unreal can make the feel of Halo but struggles with the scope. It sounds pretty intelligent of them to do this because developers won't have to bear the brunt of having to build the engine from the ground up, all the while keeping the iteration time down. But again, it circles back to my original question. Why bother going through the pain of learning a new engine where the original engine worked just fine and just needed more refinement? What could you not do with Slipspace that you're now resorting to a hybrid solution? Aside from that, I've also heard other stuff as well, like constant tension between people at the studio, with people not being happy about what is being worked on, leading to people leaving the studio, and AI being used to make games. To put it simply, hearing all this stuff has me all the more confused than frustrated, because at this point it's not just the players suffering from bad decisions being made, it's the people making those games as well. With all that out of the way, here's what I think would be the biggest issue with this endeavor. Since it's a remake of a game, it's still an old game with a new coat of paint. Sure, you're revisiting a classic, making changes here and there to make the experience better. But as a developer, are you doing that because you want to learn and understand what made the old game special and you want some of that into a new game? Or because you no longer have that level of originality and creativity anymore that you would resort to rehashing older games, expecting the brand value and the inherent nostalgia to carry the weight of its success? This has been a long-standing issue within this franchise that the games struggle to evolve any further beyond Bungie's vision. Not that the newer game's design is inherently bad, because to any extent they are still a reiteration of the original design, but the novelties introduced into it either end up not fully capturing the magic of Halo or feeling outright alien to its environment. So while remaking a game on paper is a great idea, the effect it might have in the long term is ambiguous at best and disappointing at worst, especially considering that the general consensus already doesn't like the state of modern Halo. If this remake succeeds, it might be more due to nostalgia rather than being just a great job on the preservation or elevation of a legendary design, and that's no way to dictate the future of a franchise if you're relying on an already existing narrative to keep yourself relevant, let alone popular. On top of that, I've also come to hear the rumor about the remake of Halo games might reboot the franchise, and while there's been many angles to this, like some think this shouldn't happen at all, whilst others think the modern era needs to go, here's why I think it's a bad idea on any level. While it does give you a clean slate to work with, it doesn't render you infallible to mistakes, nor does it absolve you of your responsibility to do things right. As for the argument that the modern Halo needs to go with the reboot, you're essentially sending a message that whatever you did to carry Halo forward is meaningless. Whether or not it actually had meaning is a different story. The consequences stemming from the moral weight of this one decision would be harrowing to think about. So to that group of people who think remakes or reboots would save this franchise, please stop. There is no easy answer to the situation, and brass decisions won't help. To cap this entire discussion off, I said it before and I'll say it again. If 343 Industries, now Halo Studios, wants their game to reclaim the top spot in gaming or get any close to it in any regard, be it mainline games or spin-off games or remakes, it has to be firm in its own beliefs, be honest with itself about what it's doing to hold the standards the games before have set, and above all, be unapologetically Halo. Anyway, enough of me rambling about a game. I think I've overstayed my welcome as an armchair developer at this point. Overall, I think this idea does have potential to it, and if done right, this can definitely lead to a renaissance for this franchise, but for all we know right now, it's probably not going to be what we think. If you enjoyed what I had to say, please give a like, let me know what you think about the whole situation in the comments, sub if you want to see more stuff like this. Until then, I'll see you Starside.